Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The past week has highlighted once again the fragile balance of security in Europe. Russian drones violated Polish airspace, sparking sharp warnings from Warsaw and NATO. US President Donald Trump, however, has sent mixed messages, calling the incident possibly a mistake, before later insisting Russia shouldn't have been there. At the same time, Ukraine endures its heaviest waves of drone and missile strikes in months. To assess US EU relations, Trump's comments, and prospects for peace, we're joined by Dr. Olena Lennon, Adjunct Professor, Department of National Security, Division of Government and Public Service. Dr. Lennon, welcome to TVP World. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So let's start with the drones that entered Polish airspace. 19 of them. And of course, recently we've had 3 airplanes going into Estonian airspace. What is President Trump's reaction to this violation, or these violations?
Right. Yes, you're exactly right. Russia's intensified violations of NATO's airspace have been a little bit lost on the U.S. administration, unfortunately. We have not seen an appropriate level of urgency from the U.S. government, although clearly, in the past week alone, Russia's incursions into NATO's airspace are a major escalation that require a much harder stance from all NATO allies. And I think Europeans understand it very well. I think President Trump has been trying to downplay the significance of those violations. I'm afraid that he might be misreading Russia's intentions here, because it's most experts have agreed that these attacks of violations of NATO's airspace seem quite deliberate, as a way for Russia to test NATO's response, to test NATO's air defense, preparedness, and response time. And I think the Russians are doing it quite successfully. We're yet to see a proper proportional response from the U.S. administration, but I'm hopeful that in combination with more military aid for Ukraine and tougher sanctions on Russia, that the response from the U.S. administration will be appropriate and proportional.
Right. Well, let's take each of those in turn. Let's start with the response in terms of President Trump's, indecisive answer, actually, it seems. On the one hand, it's an accident. On the other hand, he's saying it shouldn't have been there. Yeah, but does this fill other NATO members with confidence that they can rely on President Trump's support? Because this is, the US is a founding member of NATO and a key player. Can other countries count on the US?
Right. I think the relationship between the U.S. and NATO and the EU remains tense, but I would say pragmatic, cooperative nonetheless. I think progress has been made in both trade and military assistance, although I agree with you that progress has been much slower than preferred. But again, I remain hopeful, as clearly it's not lost even on President Trump now that Putin has no appetite for peace. He has no appetite for negotiations. I think finally President Trump is able to see what all of us have known for a while, that Putin's intent is to win the war, not to end the war. That he remains committed to his maximalist objectives in Ukraine, to topple Zelensky's government and to install a pro-Russian government in Kyiv. the terms of peace proposed by Russia amount to nothing short of surrender on Ukraine's part, and it's a non-starter for Ukraine. I think President Trump is slowly catching up to this notion that even he failed to convince Putin to scale down his objectives in Ukraine, as Putin remains committed to his maximalist goals. So with all of that, I'm hopeful that President Trump will rise to the occasion and will reinforce NATO's allies, particularly Eastern Flank, specific and in particular contribute to a much needed multi-layered multinational air defense, which will require pooling resources from all NATO allies and creating, call it a sky shield or a drone wall, whatever we name it. But it is clear now with repeated incursions into NATO's airspace that a multinational effort to protect Ukraine's sky is well overdue.
Right. Well, as well as the kinetic aspect of the Russian aggression, we have the economic aspect. Now, President Trump has said that he's only going to, he says he's ready to impose severe sanctions on Moscow, but only when NATO and EU members stop buying Russian energy. Well, I think that's a bit of a tall order, isn't it? I mean, to ask Turkey, for example, a NATO member, to stop buying Russian energy is perhaps falling on deaf ears. Is this just a smokescreen to delay sanctioning Russia further by President Trump?
It's definitely not is happening much slower than we would want it to be. Russia's pressure on Trump's pressure on Putin. But again, I remain optimistic because already we see Europeans' willingness to disconnect from Russian energy. Again, incrementally, perhaps not as quickly, but it is happening, as we saw in the last trade deal signed in the summer between the EU and the US on reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade. In which the EU committed to buying more energy from the US and slowly disconnecting from Russian energy completely. When it will happen, we don't know, but at least there are it's been set in motion. I agree with you that there is a lot of hesitation and delay still on the US's part, but where I see optimism is in the fact that military aid to Ukraine is now almost entirely NATO's control, that they're now collectively buying weapons and ammunition from the US and supplying to Ukraine. In that way, sustaining Ukraine in its fight is less dependent on American politics and is more in the hands of European allies. So I think that is a significant step toward that strategic autonomy that Europeans have been trying to achieve for a very long time. And unfortunately, it took the war in Ukraine to finally set that strategic autonomy in motion.
Right. Well, how prepared would you say NATO was, to stand up to Putin? I think this came as a bit of a surprise to all NATO countries. Is NATO ready?
I think they're as ready as they've ever been. I don't know how ready they are to engage Russia in a kinetic war, but they seem to be doing, all the right things in increasing preparedness, both in terms of kinetic and hybrid manifestations of the war. Will they be? Are they entirely ready? It depends on what sort of a where the battlefield is, right? So if the conversation now is about NATO putting together some type of a reassurance force for Ukraine and putting boots on the ground in Ukraine as some type of a peacekeeping force, I think NATO is well equipped to put together a peacekeeping force in Ukraine and to stabilize that line. What's missing is political will. Is NATO ready for a large-scale war with Russia? Probably not, but I doubt that Russia is ready for a war with NATO. I think it's as much in the interest of Russia to avoid a war with NATO as it is in the interest of NATO. In that way, deterrence still holds, although Russia's appetite for risk is much higher than NATO's appetite for risk, as we have seen with violations of airspace. So what I think NATO allies, where they have to step up to the occasion, is in showing a little bit more appetite for risk and showing resilience and political will in making hard decisions, and if necessary, start participating in Ukraine's air defense by actually shooting down airborne targets, airborne threat over Ukraine's sky.
Right, okay. Now, you touched on Putin's appetite for peace, which you said basically was non-existent. Do you believe that the recent celebrations in Beijing, where Putin, North Korean leaders and Chinese leaders, of course, attended, and, of course, President Vučić from Serbia attended, do you think that has emboldened Putin? Has he been reassured of China's support? And if he decides to continue this war against Ukraine and NATO?
I think that the meeting in Beijing was one remarkable piece of political theater that created the optics of a new vector of power, and a new, authoritarian bloc, if you will. That it did create that image of support, of international recognition that Putin craved after being isolated from the international stage for so long. Although I would not read into it and look at it with some caveats, because it is equally in China's interest to not to side with Russia fully and to continue cooperation with the West to avoid secondary sanctions, because China's economy relies more on the West than it does on Russia. So China and India are playing this game with Russia very delicately, and it's a tough balancing act. On the one hand, yes, they both China and India continue to sustain Russia's economy and its war chest. On the other hand, they're careful not to show full support to the extent that North Korea has, for example, to keep the West on their side and to avoid tougher sanctions. So, like I said,
can't China do more by putting pressure on Putin to go to the negotiating table and stop this war? I mean, surely that'll put China in the West's good books, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. To answer your question, can China do more? Absolutely. China has a lot of power and leverage over Russia, probably more than any other country. I think what matters the most to Xi is nuclear escalation. I do think that he has a lot of sway over Putin in making sure that this war does not escalate to nuclear levels. That is the red line for China. I think it serves, it serves China's interest to balance support for Russia against the U.S. and to undermine the power of the U.S. in that region. But clearly, the Chinese could put a lot of economic pressure and diplomatic pressure on Putin to force him to scale down his objectives. And I do think that if properly incentivized, cooperation between China and the West is possible, in which the Chinese would agree to perhaps reduce their support of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, and to put pressure on Putin to scale down his maximalist objectives.
Right.
And
well, as always, we'll be watching the whole situation very carefully. Dr. Lennon, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me.
Bye. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.